And that's why I think like at the fundamental kind of core of diversity and inclusion, whether or not we should do it in our business, like it's not a whether or not, it's like, it's just good recruiting. And the quicker that we can like separate, I think, the conversation of like, oh, this is a diversity and inclusion process, and like this is just what good recruiting looks like, I think actually that will help us go along this journey a little bit quicker, because it's driving the right outcomes for the business.
My name is Katharina, and I'm the Community and Event Manager at eCulture, a company that is on a mission to shape the world of unbiased hiring. Welcome to the Oops, I'm Biased podcast. On today's podcast episode on the Oops, I'm Biased podcast, I am interviewing Matthew Parker. We have another installment of the Talent Leader series here. Matthew Parker is a recruitment and talent acquisition executive. Lots of experience in scaling companies, at different companies, internationally, US, you name it. He's seen it all. He has recently started his own podcast, Open to Work. And today we talk about all things objective interview process to hire the best candidates at scale. And we also cover a little bit of the controversial topic around, well, what is the role of a recruiter? Are they reliable in predicting a successful candidate? Or might we also leave that to the upcoming and, innovative AI tools that are out there? We have a really interesting conversation at our hands with these two topics that we cover. And at the end, there's also a bunch of pieces of advice, best practices that Matthew shares with us all. So without further ado, I really hope that you enjoy this episode. All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Oops, I'm Biased podcast. I am your host, Katharina. Today, I am having a very special guest on the TA Leaders series. It is Matthew Parker, but I won't go into too much detail. I'll let him introduce himself in a second. We are covering today all things objective interview process to hire the right candidates at scale. And we'll also touch a little bit on the CV, AI, and sort of the recruiter's role, and whether it not be better to just toss a coin to see who the best candidate is. Bit of a controversial topic. But welcome, Matthew. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Katharina. Thanks so much for having me, and looking forward to the topics today. I mean, we could talk for hours, I think, on any of those. I guess just to introduce myself, so I'm a talent acquisition director. I started my career in executive search, hiring C-suite people all around the world for some of the fastest growing companies in the world. I then transitioned into being a leader of TA teams in-house. So started with some businesses in Australia, moved back with CultureAmp, where I scaled them from 500 to over 1,000, and then took over Zap, which is one of the fastest growing companies in Europe. And we were hiring hundreds of people, sometimes even a week, but across a month, scaled them from 100 to over 1,000. And then most recently with Procore, which is one of the world's largest software companies in construction, and scaled them from 200 to 600 outside of the US in a 5,000 person business. I recently was made redundant from that business and kind of was part of the movement of redundancies, especially in the software industry, and sort of found myself speaking and talking a lot about my experiences on LinkedIn and in other channels. And that has led me to launch another podcast, which I'll plug quickly, the Open to Work podcast. And really the focus is providing a kind of clear voice from the perspective of recruiters to help people navigate this challenging job market. There's a lot of content from people out there who may not necessarily have the experience that I or my kind of co-host James Hudson has in the world of recruiting, and we want to give people a really clear and kind of sound voice for navigating this challenging job market. So whilst looking for my full-time job, this is my full-time job.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It seems like you are the perfect guest to have on for all of the topics that we're going to talk about, just because you have ample experience on both sides. And you also have, lots of experience scaling companies. So I think this is always a bit of a topic of discussion when we talk about objectivity, inclusivity in the recruitment process. How do you make sure that you provide both of those, criteria of quality while you're scaling quickly? or while you might be hiring just for one role, whatever that might be. Do you have any thoughts? They can be as controversial as you'd like them to be, on how to ensure inclusivity and objectivity in the recruitment process, just to kick us off in the topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think my kind of most controversial take is that if businesses cared enough about this would have been solved already. And I think that's and that means that we kind of have to take this from a kind of a guerrilla warfare perspective on like how we approach some of this stuff, right? Like the reality is that diversity and inclusion sector was one of it, alongside talent acquisition, was the most badly hit through the last 18 months with layoffs around the world. And the presence of diversity and inclusion at the forefront of conversation is wildly diminished from where we were, especially from where we were in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, but even past that. And so I think we need to recognize that, that this is a conversation that is happening, not at the C-suite table that it perhaps was 4 years ago. And but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything at all. For me, when I think about what is the mechanisms that are at play to enable us to hire, excellent people at scale, that includes like an objective interview process. Like good hiring for me is objective hiring, but the challenges is the investment it takes to put those mechanisms in place and to train it at scale is extremely challenging. And only now are we starting to get to a point where technology is becoming available to be used at scale that will enable us to do that. And I've always kind of believed that unless you can mechanize a problem within the flow of interviewing, or within the flow of basically any problem, unless you can make it a seamless experience for the user, you probably aren't going to solve that problem at scale. And I think only now, with new technologies becoming available, are we really able to fundamentally solve the interviewing problem at scale over the next kind of 5 years.
Yeah, we'll get to the interviewing process in just a little bit. First of all, you already mentioned your LinkedIn, and I encourage all of the listeners to go follow you there. Also, subscribe to your podcast. I think it's amazing what you guys are doing there. We just briefly chatted about it before going on air. You commented on an article that we saw, come across our LinkedIn around the role of recruiters and whether it not be better to sort of toss a coin to see which candidate is successful. Could you give a brief summary of the article and also what sparked your post around that?
Yeah, sure. So this was an article produced by interviewing.io, and essentially they are a platform or a marketplace that enables people to practice their interviews with people from FANG businesses. So, not a bad product, but they're, and they position themselves as recruiting experts. This article specifically was essentially an academic, positioned as an academic study, using a group of recruiters reviewing CVs reviewing CVs and seeing whether or not they could correctly identify people who would successfully complete the technical test stage, and identified that AI would. There's a couple of different things that they pulled out, but one, that AI, generally speaking, would perform better than the recruiter. The other was that that between recruiters there was basically a coin flip of inconsistency, like a massive variable, whether or not they would progress the same candidate. So the same candidate could pass and fail any stage based on the recruiter who was selecting them. So there was complete inconsistency. I think that there's the interesting kernel of narrative that came out of this, I thought, was not, aside from the broader incorrect narrative that I think we took away, was that a lot is still being placed on brand names and education. And that was something that was clearly identified as most people who had certain types of education and certain types of brands on their CV were more likely to progress than others. And that the AI was irrespectively looked at those sorts of things and it was able to pick out other things outside of that. So I think that's an interesting takeaway, which I didn't talk about in my post. What I was kind of talking about in the post was this broad sentiment that I think is quite dangerous when we talk about technology, that essentially reduces the role of a recruiter to reviewing a CV. And I think this is the kernel of this narrative that we can contrast those two skill sets, I think, and conflate those two skill sets into all of what a recruiter does, which is a lot of what the public sees, is, I think, extremely dangerous and undervalues us as an industry. The post that where I kind of stand on this is that a recruiter's job and an ability to review a CV is almost irrelevant. Like it probably is, as you know, and I think that's such a small part of what they're doing. But they're trying to really understand as the brief and the long-term outcomes of the business, the long-term outcomes of the hiring manager and what they're selecting. Like someone's ability to deliver in a test is actually a really small part of what a job interview is and what success looks like in a company. And so for me, like the big question mark was, well, what was the brief? Because all the recruiters on my team, what I would challenge them on is how good are you working with the hiring manager? How well are you understanding the role and the context that it's working with it? And that's the complexity. Like I think when we look at AI, it's the hardest thing to be able to train them. Is like because hiring managers 99% of the time don't actually know what they're looking for anyway. And it's up to a really good talent partner to guide them along that journey. So the last point is that what it doesn't also do is challenge the validity of CVs at all. And I think that this market over the last year, let's say, with the advent especially of lots of different marketplace tools that will basically kind of the increasing war of bots in inverted commas, i.e. a world where CVs are being written by bots and then allegedly they're talking to bots on the other side, which is not happening now, but I think will happen at some point in the future, that we'll see a level of scale behind AI reviewing CVs. That we basically are now getting at scale a world where the use of CVs are broken. Like they are really low performing. A 7% indicator of future success in role. We've known that for like over 20 years now. And so this is only breaking even more now. CVs are kind of where we're at, but I think it's really clear that they are not the right solution long term.
Yeah, either. It's interesting. What you bring up here is that they really failed to question the validity of the CV, and also really to leave out the hiring brief completely. On this podcast, we talk a lot about stakeholder management around hiring managers. How are you being briefed? What questions are you asking? How are you ensuring that you know what required skills there are for any specific role. So I think it was quite interesting to also see there be such unquestioned support for AI in the use of the recruitment sphere. I definitely think that, I might be preaching to the choir here, but not all that glitters is gold with AI and technology and recruitment. What's your stance on that?
Yeah, we were talking about this before we went on, but my kind of most like controversial statements on LinkedIn are often connected to I say controversial, like the what I get the most negative feedback on is my like anti-AI sentiment, and I say it's more around like skepticism, right? Like I think that not all technology is good, and not all of this stuff is going to move us forward. And let's not get into kind of the broad ethics of like how these language models are actually taught in the first place. That's a whole other podcast, I think, that is around diversity and inclusion. But there is a reality where all these products are being built by people who aren't recruiters. And it's my fundamental kind of belief that we need to fully understand the challenges of the recruiting stack to enable truly understand what's going to move us forward in this world. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely things that will improve, and there already are areas of recruiting that are improving as a result of AI. But when it comes down to like assessment, I think we need to be really skeptical of like, what is the model being trained on? What is the model being looked for? How, like, if it's being trained off like historic performance data, for example, as one example, it will definitely be biased, because all historical performance data have over-indexed towards white men, essentially, like around the world. And so what we're saying is a high bar, and this has happened before, and they've done tests on this. I think in Amazon, famously did a test on this where they trained their model to identify good, high-performing people within their organization. And they just picked all the men, because their internal data suggests that they were high performing because there were more men in their business that were performing at a higher level, and that was because of the historical biases of their business. And so, like, when we think about like how like HR and AI models and how we train AI models over time, we need to be really, really thoughtful about the data that we're putting in, because it will lead to data coming out. And if we know anything about the data that we put in over the past 50 years of industry, it's that it is fundamentally biased, and certain sects of the world, i.e. white men, have been more enabled than others, which is going to lead to more biased results on the other side. So I think there is like an element of skepticism that we should apply to all of these processes, and a deeper fundamental understanding of like what can be enabled and what is a human interaction that we still are like don't fundamentally understand. People are not good at briefing. 90% of recruiters are not good at briefing for roles. And there is a mismatch here that technology could enable, But really, it's around training and enabling recruiters to have better conversations. That's where I think the next stage of AI move is going to go. And I'm not talking about the science fiction world where an AI is doing all of our jobs for us. Like, obviously, in that world, then you can do anything. But talking about the realistic next 5 years, it's all about enablement rather than it is about taking.
Yeah, that's I think wonderfully summed up. My thoughts as well on this, that it's more about enablement than just replacing certain things that historically recruiters are doing in the recruitment process. So definitely, preaching to the choir here, which is quite nice. But also, I do think it's worth having that conversation, just because you say you do get a lot of feedback, and we also do when we talk about, you should question what tools you're using, what technology you're implementing, especially if it's top-notch, shiny, innovative, anything that's new. Warrants the question of, where's the science to back this up? What is it being trained on, and what are the mechanisms behind it? And also who develops it? As you say, there's a large majority of those tools out there not developed with recruiters in mind, or with recruiters in the process there.
And it'll be interesting to see, because there will be a fundamental shift in the next 5 years. Like, that is going to happen. But I think it's more around like where we want to, like, we shouldn't just accept it on face value. I think it's up to all of us to challenge. And I'm not and I think there'll be interesting moments in the next few years where I'll be sitting there working for a company and I'll implement a technology that probably reviews, say, fees and stuff like that as part of the AI. And people say, hey, weren't you really answer this? And I was like, I was, but I think it's important to be part of the discussion and not just unequivocally accept it as being better. And I'm sure that these technologies will improve over time. And I want to provide my feedback to companies about why I'm nervous about these companies. And I think if I was a company listening to this podcast right now that was doing AI and recruiting, I would actively want someone who is a skeptic to be on my board, to an advisory team, to guide me through this, because if I'm your hardest customer to convince and I'm your most skeptical customer, then if you're doing it right, then this will be right for the entire industry, and that's what we need to index towards.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point of sort of a devil's advocate role that you might need in any decision making. So I think that is a very good piece of advice to take away if you're considering the implementation of any tool, to figure out, okay, what are strong arguments against, and do we actually have a solid base to base that decision on.
Just get in touch, reach out to me on LinkedIn if you're doing an implementation at the moment. I'm happy to review the stack with you, and I've got lots of great people in my network who I can also help with this sort of stuff. So reach out, and I'm happy to.
Wonderful. Well, talking about technology, I do think technology comes up quite a lot when we're talking about scaling processes, making sure that they're more efficient, more accessible to everyone, sort of providing equal processes. Often has to do with how can we enable recruiters with more technologically advanced tools. Now, what do you see in the interviewing process still remaining objective, and how you can hire the right candidate at scale? What's your 2 cents on that?
Sure. I mean, so there's a couple of ways to bring this down. So the data strongly indicates, and we've known this again for over 20 years, that the best ways to evaluate a candidate's future, eligibility, future kind of performance in role is through a combination of work samples and structured interviewing. And I think that, I imagine you'll probably also say there's an element of testing and stuff like that goes on the top end, which I think there is some question marks over, but yes, that also is a way of indicating future success in role. So, but let's just take structured interviewing and work samples. So we've known this for over 20 years. It's wild for me, like, how few businesses are really thoughtfully implementing this sort of stuff at scale, right? Like, if you think your biggest investment is your people, if you took on an RFP for a technology product that was going to cost you 6 figures a year, you absolutely would have a very structured and thoughtful process and return on investment of why you were going to invest in that product and why that was the right outcome for you for your business. We do not apply any of the same level of rigor through an interview process really at scale. And so A lot of it comes down to how you are on the day. We just talked about this in one of our recent episodes of the podcast. A lot of it comes down to like whether or not you ate earlier, like what you're like, all these sorts of things can layer into how you're feeling on the day. Friday, 3 p.m., like, you kind of hanker it. It's a beautiful day outside and you want to go outside and play with the kids. Like all these things can impact like how we feel on the day and how we interview. And so we've got to think about like what is as a result, how are we going to build an interview process that's going to be, a fair. For me, if I was to give a piece of advice of like what's the most fundamental piece you should look at first, it's how do you make decisions in your business for hiring? What is the framework in which you look through to make a decision that you can apply from person to person to person? If you're in a founder-led organization, I think this is even more important because the founder has to have a level of emotional investment. And what you're trying to do as the recruiting leader is translate what their knowledge, what their care and passion about, what their culture is, and translate that into an interview process. So when you present the candidate back to them and say, hey, we think this is your person, they understand the threads and how you've come to make that decision. So there's three like core ways of making a decision, I think. One is the hiring manager. So I'm the hiring manager. I've gone through the interview process. I've seen other people I've taken the feedback from everyone else and I get to make the decision. And that's I get the final decision. So that's one. A committee or decision-making process. So that's like Google do. So you complete a whole pack. This is sent to a group with a we recommend this person gets hired, and they decide whether or not the person gets hired based on the pack that they receive. And a bar raiser concept, which is basically you have kind of specialist interviewers who are trained and who kind of advocate or don't advocate for the way the interview process is run, and they have like a veto over any kind of interview outcome. And why have I spent so much time talking about this? You may be asking, because it's not technologically enabled at all. But these like core kernels are like you need to have a philosophy and a thought process behind why you make any decision in your business. And hiring is one of the ones you want to get right as early as physically possible. And lots of businesses don't do this, and they kind of make it up as they go along. And so I just recommend really to think about this, because it then kind of structures all of your other decisions and how you structure your process. So we know what the data is now. We know that we have to decide our decision-making process. And so how do we then implement an interview process that's going to enable us to succeed on both of those accounts? So there's kind of a core, from structured interviewing, the hardest thing to do is build out the competency framework that you're looking to build. So you need to have all of your questions that you want to ask someone against all of the competencies that are against that role. And then also what good or bad looks like as a response in each of those competencies. And that is a monumental amount of work. And then after all of that, you need to ensure that the interviewer is actually doing all of those things, which is for me where technology, to come back to the original question, is going to have the biggest leap. Interviewing has been a black box for decades in recruiting. We have no idea what is happening between Katerina and Matthew. Not a clue, except for the fact that they might put in some notes, and depending on the person, there'll be a relative variance of what those notes, how detailed those notes are, until basically the last 12 to 18 months, where we've seen a really big growth of products that are either transcribing, recording, or enabling better interview processes in the room. So we've got like Brightheart, we've got MetaView, we've got Evidence, we've got a bunch of others, right, that are really prominent in this space now. And I think that those, for me, when I look about all of the different technologies in all of recruiting right now, those are going to be the ones that will fundamentally improve the recruiting process and make them less biased than they historically have been, and have the biggest impact over our ability to make good decisions.
Yeah. Well, you sort of gave us a really good overview of all of what goes into creating a more structured interview process at scale. What do you think the bottlenecks are mainly for companies when they set up that process or when they come to any decision leading up to how can we structure this better?
Yeah, I think resources and time is a really big one, because you have to go through all of your roles. You have to create competency frameworks. You have to create better or worse, different versions of what, good and bad outcomes. Requires very experienced and knowledgeable recruiting leaders and project managers to help guide hiring managers who also don't often know the like good and bad of this, right? And so if you look at that as like a whole project, it's like it's a year long or multi-year project that you have to continue to iterate and invest in all the time. So it's quite hard to like gather the momentum within a business to really invest in those sorts of things. When I've done this historically, I've taken on chunks of the business at a time. So and the biggest return on investments. So for example, if you are high volume hiring salespeople into your organization, or SDRs is what I did in my last business, I'd really double down on rebuilding that interview process first. It's the highest ROI to the business. It was the most volume of roles that we had in. It's also the roles that fed the enablement and the growth throughout the entire rest of the business. And so that if I got I knew that if I got the SDR pool right, the diversity in 2 years' time would be way better than it is now. And so that was where based on all of those business decisions, that's where I invested first. And that had a massive increase. We took it from 30% female to 50% 50% female, amongst a number of other metrics that we couldn't track because of our ATSs, but we also improved on a number of other metrics. And that was through a highly structured, competency-based interview process with a task at the core of it that we rolled. It took us about 8 weeks to build and roll out, and then the outcomes we noticed within 6 weeks, and then it was rolled out across the entire company of a 5,000 person company within the next 3 months, because the volume and the pace and the quality of the candidates we were getting was really high.
Wow. Walk us through that process then. What did it look like, what you created in those 8 weeks? What exactly does it look like?
Yep. So we started off. So so why don't I kind of just go through that? If this was like an interview question, I guess this is how I kind of could respond to it, and check my podcast for a much more concise version of this. But basically, the problem that the business had at the time was that they had almost a 90 to 100 day time to hire at a really low diversity and inclusion rate for this business unit, SDRs, whilst also needing to hire them at volume. So they were missing business targets. They literally were losing money through not having this sort of role being filled very, very quickly. And so the core challenge was, I need to find a way to dramatically increase the time to start for this cohort, and ideally also improve our diversity inclusion rate. But that was my goal. That wasn't the business's goal. I want to be really clear on that, right? So the first thing we did was get all of the stakeholders on board and help them and understand, listening to them all around the world, like, what do you think good looks like in this profile? What do you look for? And what we really quickly understood was that there was an inconsistency by what they said they were looking for and what they actually felt was good. And when they looked at the data within their internal business, they realized that all these requirements that they had been pushing us for, that was slowing down the interview process historically, was not needed. And we could really double down on these like very specific personality trait oriented skills. You are like super you have a very strong desire to be successful in sales. You are really, really hungry, and you are super resilient. You have a super good understanding of a super good intuition for objection handling and stuff like that. Like, these are things that are really hard to identify unless you have a very good and structured interview process. And so after doing a couple of weeks of consultation, I built out a new flow. So we took our 7-stage process down to 3 stages. And then at each stage, there was a very specific outcome that we were trying to achieve. So one stage, for example, was a work sample, which is basically, you have to pick. We're going to give you loads of information, like a ton of information, exactly what you need to do to pitch to us. I need to do a 10-minute cold call example with us. And then we're going to see how you respond in that. And we wanted people to understand that 90% of your job is getting on the phone and cold calling someone. So if you're not comfortable doing that, this isn't the job for you. And that helped weed out people very quickly as well. We then went through 2 structured interview questions. And so we also had a scorecard criteria that was did they do X? Yes, no. Did they do X? Yes, no. And if they ticked more than 6 of those boxes, they passed. And because they're this is they don't know what they're doing. It's their first ever attempt at doing this. So they don't need to be perfect. And what we realized in the first few attempts of this is that we were like, oh, well, they didn't do all these other things. I'm like, yeah, but we don't need them to do that, because we're going to train them that. What we're looking for is the intuition of that they knew to even try, or they knew to push back slightly, or they gave 1 good attempt or 2 good attempts at objection handling. Those are the sorts of things that we were looking for. So that was a tick box exercise, which was quite effective actually. And then we then had 2 structured interview stages, which again had very specific questions, very specific gradings 1 through to 4 of what the good or bad looked like throughout. And then when we got to the debrief, we collected all of this data together and said, are they a pass, or should we hire them or not, based on the data that was coming through. And then the recruiter, because they had the competency response framework, could say, hey, Jim, you rated this person a 3 for this question. Looking through your notes here that you've done, I can't see, that looks like a 2. Are we sure that this is the right score? Do we think that, is this something we need to dig into in a bit more detail? And this completely also changed the language in which our recruiters can engage with our hiring managers to make better decisions as a business. And so we moved from a 7-stage, 90-day plus unstructured interview process to a 3-stage time to start of 60 days or 50 days at its best, where the actual process could be run in 7 days. We would often get candidates apply on a Monday and they'd be offered the following Monday. And that would happen on a regular basis. And so this has fundamentally changed the diversity and inclusion of our business, and also the revenue outcomes for the business that will then hit it. It then had a full stack of team within 3 months of releasing this process. I had a full team ready to go. So had a fundamental revenue outcome of the business. And so this is, I think, a good example of it's called this is called skills-based hiring. Firstly, the concept that was behind it was that we could pull literally any person off the street, put them through the process, and we would know whether or not they were going to be a good salesperson. And secondly was that this is what I describe as guerrilla diversity and inclusion, is in no one else, but it's also just good recruiting. And that's why I think at the fundamental kind of core of diversity and inclusion, whether or not we should do it in our business, it's not a whether or not, it's just good recruiting. And the quicker that we can separate, I think, the conversation of this is a diversity and inclusion process, and this is just what good recruiting looks like. I think actually that will help us go along this journey a little bit quicker, because this is driving the right outcomes for the business, which is ultimately, and diversity and inclusion, sadly, I think is not part of the narrative of whether or not it's the right outcome, but I can get you a salesperson quicker is the outcome. And that also, we were able to correlate with gets right outcome for diversity and inclusion.
What I hear you say is, on the one hand, making the process a lot leaner, making the process a lot more structured, and then also looking at, what actually makes someone successful in that role. So looking at that competency framework that you mentioned. So those 3 things, I think, stick out the most to me when you explain that. I think those are really good pointers already for anyone listening to see, how can we make sure that our interview process, or when from application to hired or to offer, is a lot more palatable, also in terms of candidate experience. I think that in this market is really, really important. And it also speaks to the, objectivity and also inclusivity of the process to be a lot more responsive, be a lot faster, and also be very clear on what are we actually looking for, what makes a candidate successful. Was there anything I missed here?
Yeah, and I think there's a critical thing that I missed out in that, it's all well and good for me to theoretically understand that this is a way better way to hire, but how you implement it and whether or not it's easy for the interviewers to do is whether it is the entire hill on which these sorts of projects live and die. So, for example, one of the things we had Smart Recruiters, which doesn't, I think, really enable very good and structured assessment processes. But one of the things we did was build our own custom template within Smart Recruiters that was just for this interview process, where they could see not only the questions that they had to ask by person, but also the competency framework that sat within it, i.e. what good looked like across each stage. And that was really important, because they were mechanized, to come back to that initial term, on how to do it right. It was easier for them to do it right than it was for them to make it up themselves. And that is the gap between all of these sorts of recruitment processes. Do whatever you want in the interview process. If it's not easier for the interviewer to do it the way that you want it to do it, they're going to do it their own way. And that is the fundamental reason why all of these tools, I think, are coming out in the world. Unless you can see it on your screen, unless it's right there in front of you, I just don't believe that it's going to shift a behavior in the interviewers that's going to get what you are kind of the outcomes that you're looking to drive. And that's why we should be looking at these sorts of kind of options when we also are thinking about widespread interview enablement. And again, that's just added a cost level to it, which helps these things not get signed off internally.
Such a great soundbite that you gave us there. If your process that you're trying to implement is not easier, then you won't be successful. They'll just go with the gut feeling or the way that they feel on the day. I think you mentioned that earlier as well, that it's so dependent on how do we feel, what time of the day is it, have you eaten, which are really bad markers for that. Now we're already at the end of this podcast episode, which I think we could have just carried on talking for another hours, or at least I could have listened to you for a few more hours. Would you like to share some last tidbits of advice or best practices that you can share with our audience, what they can do starting tomorrow potentially, well, even if they have no budget at all, to make their process more structured, more objective.
Yeah. So the first thing is to really understand the science behind assessment methodologies. Like I've been asked, I've been lucky enough to kind of advise many people through my career who are coming up through the ranks of recruiting, and they kind of ask me like, what's one thing you kind of wish you'd learn, or what's one kind of advice you'd give? And it's that, like, you need to understand your art and your science exceptionally well, and the data behind it, so that you can push back. So there's a couple of books. I don't know if you can see my shelf here, but a couple of them are like Working Backwards. I would recommend reading, and the other one is Work Rules by Laszlo Block. They're Google and Amazon. Like the first 3 or 4 chapters basically go into how they mechanize their interview process at scale within Google and Amazon, and they are like some of the largest scientific studies on humans in workplaces have been done at those 2 businesses. And so they're really important, like, pieces of literature for HR leaders around the world. The other one is the SHRM assessments methodology, article against a meta-analysis of 20 of hundreds of different assessment methodologies around the world, and they do a fantastic meta-analysis. But it's important that you understand the science, so that when an interviewer goes, yeah, I'm just going to like wing it or whatever, you have the science to back up what you're going to say. And you can say, hey, at Amazon, they do this, or at Google, they do this. And you can speak to it at the level of authority and knowledge that they don't have, because you are the expert in that room. And so when it comes down to like all this other stuff is table stakes, unless it's kind of irrelevant, as you understand why you're recommending implementing. And it also comes down to, like, if you're existing within a business in a larger company, it helps you understand whether or not the way that we are assessing now is good or bad, and can help you look at it critically and recommend improvements. And this will help you level up your career, because you can articulate yourself more clearly on why you think it's biased, why you think it's not going to drive the outcome. So I think that's like a starting point for everyone. And then the second kind of piece is to start a narrative within your business around decision making. Look at how your business makes decisions, and think about how you could, because it doesn't cost any money to have that conversation internally, and looking at the different ways that different businesses make decisions over time, and like start there. Because if you can start to build out frameworks of how you make decisions and convictions to hire and stuff like that, it's the beginning point between building an assessment methodology across a company. And if you have a founder that's bought into, like, I want to be able to know this about every single employee that walks through my door, that's what you need them to say, for you to capture that and say, okay, so in order for you to do that, I need this. And there, all of a sudden, we've started a journey. And I think that is, those 2 elements could be a game changing for your career individually, but also for the impact and diversity inclusion.
Matthew, thank you so much for having this conversation with me on the podcast. I learned a lot today. I hope that we can do a follow-up someday on all of these topics. I also urge everyone who listened today to go follow Matthew on LinkedIn. Also, check out the Open to Work podcast. It's a fantastic resource for anyone and everyone in recruitment. I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did, Matthew.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. I'm a massive nerd, as you can tell, about this sort of stuff. So any chance I can get to talk about it, I often will take.
Well, thank you so much again for accepting our invitation. To everyone who listened to today, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. We are a bi-weekly podcast, so please come back for another episode in 2 weeks. Let us know how you enjoyed this conversation and what you would like to see next from us. And I'll see you very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.